Jessica Jones, Marvel's that girl, meaning that girl who is just filled with trauma. In fact, her entire life is built around surviving abuse, manipulation, and betrayal, most notably from Kilgrave. Now, the psychological fallout of his control is massive. Classic PTSD symptoms, hypervigilance, flashbacks, avoidance, and self-medication through alcohol. And what makes her stand out is that she never buys into the idea of being healed or being pure. Jessica operates in a messy middle. Damaged and cynical, but still capable of loyalty and love when it really counts. So for her, cynicism is her armor. She distrusts institutions, authority, and even friendships, but this is because every time she's leaned on something stable, it's collapsed or been taken from her. So she builds her identity around independence, even when it isolates her from other people. And she still has this desire to attach. And that's why she thrives as a private investigator, a job that lets her dig into other people's secrets while keeping her own stuff like completely sealed off. And we can see her defense mechanisms clearly on display. Like her classic alcohol abuse is her numbing strategy. She doesn't drink not just to forget, but to mute the volume, which is her hyper awareness. She's, very sarcastic and hostile. She got a sharp tongue, and it's not just humor, it's a weapon to push people away before they get too close to where they can hurt her. And then she isolates herself. I don't need anyone is her mantra, even though she absolutely does need people. So this push and pull dynamic is, a defining moment in who Jessica really is. Now, she has some deeply ambivalent attachment styles. She fears intimacy because the closeness equates vulnerability, but at the same time, she really craves it. So why else would she keep returning to Trish or Luke? Her relationships are riddled with guilt, not for saving people, but for hurting people, for surviving when others didn't. So she struggles to accept the fact that she can be loved without any strings attached, and that's a big part of her. And she fits this archetype of the wounded hero. She's not Wonder Woman flying to inspire humanity. She's more like a dark version of Achilles, immensely strong, but with a wound, psychological, but not, obviously not physical. And this is what defines her. She represents the survivor myth. The truth that being a hero isn't always about being unbroken. Sometimes it's about getting back up after being completely broken down. So she is the psychological embodiment of survivor without glamour. She's what happens when trauma doesn't create a martyr or a saint, but just a messy, cynical, brutally human survivor. She doesn't want to be a role model, but ironically, she kind of makes her one. She proves that you don't have to be perfect, healed, or even sober to fight for others. You just have to keep showing up, which epitomizes Jessica's spirit, like right to the heart.